The laughter started before Earl Hutchins even made it back to his truck. I could hear it rolling across the gravel parking lot of Delacroix Feed and Supply like a wave, low at the first, then building, then spilling out the open screen door and following him all the way to his rusted 1964 Ford F-7. Three men stood on the wooden porch, and not one of them had the decency to wait until I was out of earshot. "Ducks," said one of them, drawing the word out long and smooth, like I was tasting something sour. The man wants to run ducks through his rice field. More laughter. The kind that isn't really about something being funny. The kind that is about making a man feel small. Earl put his hand on the door handle. The room was warm from the June sun. I did not turn around. I did not raise his voice. I stood there for just a moment, on a breath, maybe to then opened the door, climbed in, and pulled it shut behind him with a soft, deliberate click. Through the dusty windshield, I could still see them. Dale Fontino, the parish's biggest rice broker, was bent nearly double laughing, his two associates following along the way they always get. Earl started the engine. It coughed once, then caught. I had 300 acres of rice sitting in standing water back home and something was eating it alive. I had no money for chemicals. I had no credit left at the co-op. But I still had his ducks. And here is what none of those men on that porch understood yet. The ducks were going to be the whole answer. Evangeline Parish, Louisiana, summer of 1971. Earl Hutchins was 53 years old, a lean man, not tall, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same dark wood as his fence posts. He wore khaki work pants, a long-sleeved chambray shirt rolled to the elbows, and a canvas hat that had long since lost whatever shape it started with. He didn't say much. When he did speak, people tended to listen. His equipment was old, not charming old, but constant repair old. His wife Cecile kept the household accounts. His youngest son Thomas, 15 that summer, worked alongside his father every day school wasn't in session. That was the entirety of the Hutchins farming operation. It started in the second week of June, about 3 weeks after Earl had finished flooding his fields. Thomas spotted it first. He came in on an evening with mud to his knees and a look on his face that Earl had learned to read over 15 years of farming alongside the boy. Not panic, but something quieter and more serious than panic. "Daddy," he said, setting his boots by the back door, "you need to walk the north field in the morning." Earl walked it before sunrise. The rice water weevil had come in harder than anything he'd seen in 25 years. The larvae were feeding on the roots beneath the waterline, and the damage was already visible in the way the young plants stood, slightly yellowed, slightly loose in the mud, like they'd lost their grip on the earth. He walked every row of every field that morning. By the time he came back to the house for coffee, he knew the full picture. All 300 acres were affected. The south fields showed the first signs of stem borers moving along the edges. And along the canal bank, grassy weeds were beginning to choke the margins. 3 problems, all at once, all feeding on each other. The chemical solution was straightforward. Any extension agent would have said the same thing: carbofuran for the weevils, a follow-up herbicide pass for the weeds. Earl knew the names, knew the application rates. He also knew exactly what it would cost. He and Cecile went through the numbers together that evening, quietly, carefully, without drama. The treatment for 300 acres would run between 800 and 1,000. They had 112 in the farm account. That was when Dale Fontino entered the picture. Dale was 44, broad-shouldered, and wore his prosperity the way some men wear cologne, heavily and in all directions. He ran Fontino Rice brokered out of a cinder block office on the edge of Ville Platte, and he held informal sway over a network of chemical suppliers, equipment dealers, and parish officials that made him, in practical terms, the most powerful man in the local rice economy. He had been after Earl's land for 2 years. Not aggressively, Dale Fontino was too smart for that. He made his offers sound like favors. Now, with 300 acres of rice under siege and no money for chemicals, he was about to get his second opportunity. Earl had spent 4 days thinking through his options before he drove to that feed store. He had pulled out the old LSU agricultural bulletins he kept in a cardboard box under the workbench in his barn, bulletins on integrated pest management, on rice paddy ecology, on the natural feeding behavior of domestic ducks in flooded field conditions. Somewhere 15 years old. He had read them carefully, and he had made his decision. He needed 25 Indian runner ducks. Tall, upright birds that moved through water efficiently, didn't trample rice plants the way heavier breeds would, and were aggressive, tireless feeders. The Croydon supply was the only place within 40 miles that could source them. So Earl walked through the screen door and asked Raymond Delacroix quietly if he could get 25 Indian runners within the week. Raymond was a decent enough man, but not on how to keep his voice down when something surprised him. Indian runners? What in the world for, Earl? Earl explained it briefly, without decoration, the weevil pressure, the weed problem along the edges, how ducks moving through flooded rice in controlled rotations would feed on the larvae in the water, consume the aquatic weeds, and fertilize the standing water with their waste, feeding the very soil the rice was growing in. It was an old method, older than chemicals, older than most of the men in that feed store. Raymond's expression beat a smooth journey from surprise to uncertainty to something close to pity. That was when the screen door opened and Dale Fontino walked in, wearing a clean white shirt despite the heat, carrying a coffee from the diner across the street, moving through the space the way powerful men do in rooms they consider their own. He took in the scene quickly and smiled. Raymond answered before Earl could even turn around. Earl here wants to buy himself 25 Indian runner ducks. Says he's going to run them through his fields to handle the weevil problem. The smile on Dale's face began to get bigger. It got slower, more deliberate. He set his coffee on the counter and looked at Earl with the expression of a man choosing very carefully how much of what he is feeling to show. Ducks, he said. That is right, Earl said. Then Dale laughed. Not cruelly, almost worse than that. Amused. The laugh of a man watching a child try to fix a tractor with a crayon. Earl, you've got weevils and stem borers moving through 300 acres of standing rice in the heat of June, and your answer is ducks. He said it flatly, like he was repeating something a child had told him. Then his voice softened into something that wanted to sound like generosity. You can make on a phone call, get a spray rig out to your place by the weekend. We settle the bill at the harvest. A pause. Or you could wait on your ducks. Earl looked at him for a moment, not with anger, not with embarrassment, and said simply, I appreciate that. I'll let you know. He turned back to Raymond and arranged the order. Walking to his truck, he heard the laughter start. He heard Dale's voice carrying across the gravel. Ducks, I swear to you. Ducks. He put his hand on the door handle, let the laughter settle around him like weather. Then he got in, started the engine, and drove home to his fields. The ducks arrived Thursday morning, 23 Indian runners, too short of the 25 he'd asked for, sourced from a farm outside Appaloosas. When Earl and Thomas unloaded them into the holding pen, the birds stood tall and alert, their bodies upright like a row of Vine battles, their dark eyes moving quickly over everything. They're skinny, Thomas said. They're built for moving, Earl said, not for sitting still. I had spent the 4 days of waking doing what nobody standing on that porch would ever see or think about, the preparation. I divided his fields mentally into 4 sections of roughly 80 acres each, mapped them on graph paper with a pencil and ruler. I walked each section with a length of rebar marked in 1-inch increments, checking water depths. Indian runners fed best between 4 and 8 inches deep. The north field was running close to 10 inches in places. I spent the better part of Tuesday afternoon adjusting riser boards on the levee pipes, dropping levels carefully, checking and rechecking. I built temporary drift fences from wooden stakes and chicken wire, for corridor lanes across the north field, each roughly 20 yards wide, creating channels that would guide the ducks in lawn, systematic passes through the rice rather than letting them wander. Thomas straightened up at on a point, pushed his head back, and looked at the arrangement of stakes and wire running out across the flooded field in the late afternoon light. This is going to work? He asked, not skeptically, but genuinely. Earl drove another stake. Ask Mistrzostwom Europy in 3 weeks, he said. They released the first 8 birds into the northernmost corridor on Thursday morning, 2 hours after sunrise. What happened in the next hour was one of the most purposeful things Earl Hutchins had ever watched. The Indian runners entered the corridor single file, instinctively, and began to work. Their heads went down in that rapid, rhythmic sewing machine motion of ducks feeding in earnest, not dabbling, but hunting. They moved through the rice rows without disturbing the plants, their narrow, upright bodies slipping between the stems with a precision that a wider breed could never have managed. Every few feet, on a wood plant its entire head beneath the surface, rooting along the muddy bottom where the weevil larvae were concentrated. Earl stood on the levee bank and watched without moving for nearly 40 minutes. They were not wandering. They were systematically clearing every living pest they could find. By the end of the second week, Earl had rotated all 23 ducks through every corridor lane in the north and northeast fields twice, and had begun moving them into the south fields where the stem borer pressure was concentrated. Here the ducks moved closer to the field margins, feeding on the aquatic grasses beginning to compete with the rice along the water's edge, dismantling the weed pressure bit by bit, root by root. Every evening, Earl walked a different section with his measuring stick and a small notebook, recording water depths and noting which sections looked cleanest, in the cramped, careful handwriting of a man who had never gone past the 8th grade but had never stopped learning. On the 14th day, he knelt at the edge of the north field and pulled a rice plant carefully from the mud. He rinsed the roots in the field water and held them up in the late afternoon light. White. Clean. Undamaged. He held them there for a moment, alone, no one watching. Then he set the plant gently back in the mud, pressed it in with 2 fingers, and stood up. There was still work to do. The rice told the story before Earl said a word to anyone. By the end of the 4th week of July, the north field, the section that had shown the heaviest weevil damage in early June, the section Dale Fontaine's spray rig would have hit first, was standing fuller and greener than anything Earl had grown in the previous 5 seasons. The plants had the deep, saturated green of rice when its roots are healthy and its soil is feeding it properly. The water between the rows had a clean, dark quality, enriched before weeks of duck manure breaking down in the warm shallows, releasing nitrogen directly where the rice roots could draw on it. Earl had not sprayed a single chemical. He had not purchased a single bag of synthetic fertilizer. What he had spent in total was 31 on the ducks, 4 on staples, and the better part of 3 weeks of his and Thomas's labor. Word moved through Evangeline Parish the way words move in small places, quickly and in all directions. A young extension agent named Broussard drove out from the parish office and introduced himself respectfully at the edge of the field. They walked the levees together for nearly an hour, and Broussard kept stopping to crouch down and study the plants, the water clarity, the condition of the soil. Mr. Hutchkins, the young man said finally, standing up and holding his head in both hands, I have to be honest with you. I would not have recommended this. I would have told you to spray. I looked out over the field. I would have been wrong. Earl nodded once, quietly, and they walked on. The harvest came in the 3rd week of August. When they took the grain to the elevator in Ville Platte and got the yield numbers back, Earl stood at the counter and read the ticket twice, not from surprise, but because he wanted to be sure he had it right before he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. The North Field had yielded 4,100 pounds per acre. The parish average that season was 3,200. He had outproduced his neighbors by nearly 900 pounds per acre on ground that had been written off in June as a probable loss. He was at the top settling his account when Dale Fontino walked inaczej the room tego exactly quiet, but it changed. Dale came to the counter and had the decency not to pretend it was a coincidence. He stood beside Earl and looked at the counter, then at Earl. I heard the yield numbers, he said. Earl tucked his paid receipt into his pocket. Good harvest, he said simply. A pause. Dale's jaw worked slightly. The easy confidence he wore like a second skin was still there, but it fit differently now, a little loose across the shoulders, a little uncertain at the color. How many ducks you figure it took? He asked. Not McKinley. Just asking. Earl picked up his head from the counter and put it on. 23, he said, and about 40 years of paying attention. He nodded to the man behind the counter and walked out into the August heat, and the screen door swung shut behind him, and the room stayed quiet for a long moment after he was gone. The following spring, Dale Fontino called Earl Hutchkins on the telephone. Not to make an offer on the land, not to talk brokered rates. He called because his own 300 acres were showing early weevil pressure in the second week of May 1972 and the chemical costs had gone up that winter. Somewhere between August and May, Dale had done enough thinking to make a phone call he didn't particularly enjoy making. Earl listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then he said, "Come out Saturday morning. Bring your boots." Dale came. He came without the clean white shirt and without the coffee from the diner. He came in work clothes, and he stood at the edge of Ellis Field in the early morning light and watched the Indian runners moving through the rice corridors. Earl had 31 birds bitten. Dale asked his questions carefully and listened to the answers without argument. Earl showed him everything: the drift fence system, the corridor rotation, the water depth management, the morning feeding schedule. He walked him through it all with the same patience he brought to showing Thomas. He never mentioned the feed store parking lot. He never mentioned the laughter. He simply showed the man what he knew because the land needed it and the asking had been genuine.